Now we have time for discussion. Thank you, audience, for keeping your questions so far. So now you have possibility to make questions. Please.
Mikael, thank you for the presentations. I wonder, in particular in the SUBMARINER program, you listed the opportunities and barriers. Can you rank the barriers in any way, or is it just a whole cloud of it? Thank you.
We had big discussions on that, whether you could also rank the potentials of multi-use, but in fact decided that we would sort of, not do so. I would say that in terms of priorities, it's indeed that, yes, technology is important, but that currently the regulatory framework in terms of really having different regimes and the issue of having a primary user with sort of more power is the most important barrier. And then last but not least, of course, I mean, this goes without saying that both uses, I mean, there is no such case that that multi-use may sort of open the possibility of a use which is otherwise not possible in that given sea area on a single-use basis. So where aquaculture is not possible, it will also not be possible if you have a multi-use solution. That has to be very clear.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Well, hello. I'm Sonja Sarovius-Larrea from Åbo Academy. And I have a question concerning this gravel extraction and sand extraction. Because we have a case on Åland Islands, for example, when a pretty small hole was digged in the western part of Eckerö. And 20 years later, it's still, or the bottom fauna has not recovered. And in a sense, the animals get back there each year, but in the end of the autumn, there is anoxia and everything is dead. So my question goes, of course, to Jyrki. Surprise. And I wonder about the monitoring of these sucked places. What are you checking and for how long?
The monitoring program is, I think it's set up by the regulating authorities. That means it is the AVI which gives the permission for sand and gravel extraction. But in this case, in the Åland Islands, this extraction took place in the 70s, I guess, and that it happened very close to the shoreline. This such a extraction activity would not have the permission anymore today. It was too close to the shoreline and a shallow place. So, but I think the monitoring of these activities takes place, I think, at least 5 or 10 years after the extraction. So, because at the moment there is no extraction in Finland. The last event was the extraction in Helsinki for the Vuosaari Harbour, 2004 to 2006, and I think that the monitoring is still going on there, but it depends on the conditions set by the regulating authority.
Thank you.
The next question. First row, please.
Blue growth and blue economy are by definition sustainable activities, and in that sense extraction of mineral resources is perhaps not strictly speaking blue growth, because it's not based on renewable resources. The question actually is whether it can be made ecologically sustainable, and my question is, has anybody thought of some compensation of the potential damage caused by gravel and sand extraction, for instance by replacing or substituting the areas that may have caused damage to?
If the question was for me, the answer is I don't know. Has anybody thought of this? But probably the working group set by the Ministry of Environment will do that now as part of their work, and that's maybe a good thing to keep in mind. This was a good suggestion.
And this is not only for gravel extraction, it's also a matter of building windmill parks or anything. There's a lot of discussion whether they should be compensated by producing some habitats that may have been destroyed elsewhere, and how to calculate this amount of compensation.
If you have a question, I mean, yes, there is policy that offshore wind parks are compensating, for instance, displacement of fishery, and of course this is an actual fact. I cannot talk about sand and gravel. I think that your point that this was interesting, that this sector had not been mentioned so far that strongly, is interesting, because it's of course a big blue economy sector, and it's also there's at least policy on how to take into account the environmental impacts, both affecting extraction as well as coming from sand and gravel extraction.
Yes, yeah, I can of course say that financial compensation, of course, takes place for the fishermen, for example, or has been taking place. But I thought you were meaning more like ecological.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. The next one, Sanna.
Sanna Kuningas from Luke. And as a kind of answer for Markus' question is that I think there was just the first example of this kind of compensation in terms of, this is more like a construction case, is like in Helsinki, these Kruunusillat that are going to be, well, they're thinking about starting to build these from 2020 onwards, and there's now these kind of discussions on, because there's a white fish reproductive area, which they are basically, at least part of it, they are going to destroy. So there's now some discussions on ecological compensation in that area, particularly having this whitefish in mind. And more, I think these kind of compensational measures are going to be implemented in the years to come. Just a quick note.
Thank you. It's almost time to close the session, but I think I will have a last question. It's directed to Angela and Eeva. So it's always interesting to see new concepts and ideas. But how about the time horizon? Do you have any vision or estimate when could society be ready to make a real investment for multi-platform, for instance?
It's definitely already taking place in the North Sea, where you have, the also spatial efficiency issue, and if you have already pointed out the project in Belgium, but there's also a project in the Netherlands, where in fact a big retailing company as well as a big textile producer is investing into seaweed cultivation, and actually even within the offshore wind parks. So that's really private money coming in. And as I told you already over the coffee break, the motivation why it's then multi-use may be a bit ironic, but it's because in the North Sea, the offshore wind parks have been opened recently in terms of allowing access in between the offshore wind park for boats. And it's not something the offshore wind park developers are particularly happy about. And that's why they now increasingly let seaweed cultivation into it, because then they have a more controlled access to the offshore wind park. So it's in fact here the motivation comes really from that the seaweed cultivation, and that's the cultivation which is easier for offshore wind parks than fish aquaculture, because it needs less maintenance, etc. And here there is an economic push from the seaweed industry that there is really now investment coming into it. That's a precondition, and then it's actually also from the offshore wind that they now allow access into it. So it's a win-win, which has to come. So in North Sea, and as I said, I think that in terms of visioning, despite all the barriers, that since the synergies are much easier to create when you have a joint development, well, I don't know in terms of Finland when it will come.
Yes, I would say that it depends a lot how the legislation and the marine spatial planning develops in the few coming years. If it develops in kind of a looking to the future, then I don't know, maybe 10 years. But
even though I'm really by heart marine spatial planner, etc., I would, however, also like to point out that this is now in the pre-planning stage. It's a precondition, but then, of course, all the other issues in terms of insurance, de-risking, etc., that has nothing to do with maritime spatial planning. This is coming then from, other factors have to come in and have to be lowered. So, but I think that this is sort of a good starting point.
Okay, thank you. Now I think it's time to thank once again all the speakers and also the audience for a very interesting discussion. And now I think it's time for networking break, and please come back 5 to 3. Thank you.